So to answer this, I would highly recommend you check out Romans 3. Romans 3 gives, I think, probably one of the most robust breakdowns of how the Old Testament relates to the New Testament, with respect at least to the Messiah and to Torah versus Messiah. So I think the best answer to this is found at the end of Romans 3. You should read the whole thing for context, but I'll just use this as kind of the basis for the answer. So it says at the end of Romans 3, therefore he will consider righteous the circumcised on the ground of trusting, and the uncircumcised through that same trusting. And so essentially what Paul is saying is that it's by trust that salvation comes, regardless of whether that trust was occurring while under the law or while under grace. And so the question is, trust in what? Because if the Messiah had not yet come, then what was it that they were trusting in? Were they trusting in the law? Were they trusting in the prophets? Or were they trusting in the coming Messiah? So I would contend that trust in God has been the thing that's made people righteous since before the law. So if you go all the way back to Abraham, before the law was even established, trust in God was the thing that made him righteous. Noah's trust in God was the thing that made him righteous, right? All the way throughout the whole of Scripture, inside and outside of the law, it is by trust that people are made righteous. And to your point about whether the Jews of the Old Testament had an advantage because they didn't have the opportunity to reject the Messiah, I would actually argue that they did have the opportunity to reject the Messiah. In fact, I would even contend that prior to the coming of the Messiah, the Pharisees and the Sadducees and many within the legalistic groups of Israel had already rejected the Messiah by elevating the following of the law over trust in God. You have to remember that Jesus' death wasn't only about making a way for sin to be abolished and for us to enter into heaven, right? Like that was a logistical thing that was necessary, just to satisfy the legal requirements and all of the stuff that's going on in the spiritual. But with relation to us, I would contend that most of what Jesus' life and death was actually about was to demonstrate to us what trusting God actually looks like. Through his life, he demonstrated trusting God by walking by the Spirit and only doing what he saw his Father in heaven revealing, right? And so he demonstrated to us how we are to walk by trust and not by sight. When facing death, he demonstrated trust in God by expressing his desire for the cup to pass from him and for him to avoid the cross, and yet still placing the will of the Father above his own desires. And so, in facing his own demise, he demonstrated trust in God by showing the juxtaposition between his personal desires being submitted to the will of God. And then finally on the cross in saying, to you I commend my spirit, in releasing his soul, right? Because it said he gave up his life, meaning that by some supernatural capability, the people were unable to take his life from him on the cross, but he actually gave that up. And so in giving up his life on the cross, he demonstrated his trust in God that he would be able to raise him from the dead and bring him back into his fullness. And so Jesus' life, death, and resurrection is the template, the perfect template for trusting in God. And so kind of circling all of this back around to whether the Old Testament, pre-Jesus Jew had an advantage because it didn't have the opportunity to reject the Messiah, I would say that rejecting the Messiah really is just representative of rejecting trust in God as the path to righteousness, because that's ultimately what the Pharisees did. They felt that following the law was the path to righteousness, or upholding the law was the path to righteousness, and whereas trusting God had always been the path. And so the Messiah being the representation of that trust, the perfect representation of that trust, I think that's ultimately what people are, like, that's what's rejected. It's not the Messiah himself necessarily. It is, or at least it's not the Messiah himself that's problematic when somebody is rejecting that. It's rejecting what he represents, which is that you cannot get to God through works. You can only get to him through obedience, submission, and trust, and trust being the absolute foundation. I know that answer was a little bit sloppy, and I could probably do a more comprehensive breakdown on that at some point in time if need be, but hopefully that provides the answer you're looking for. And always, if you're watching this video and you like this content and you'd like me to talk about some other topic, or you have other questions that I can answer, please drop them in the comments and I will make a video answering the questions that you have as best as I possibly can.